There is a problem sitting at the center of general aviation right now that has been building for decades, that every serious pilot knows exists, that every aircraft manufacturer has been quietly planning around, and that the broader public has largely never heard of. It is not a dramatic problem. There is no single accident, no regulatory collapse, no company going bankrupt that triggered it. It is slower than that, and in some ways more unsettling because of it. It is the problem of the fuel that powers the overwhelming majority of piston general aviation aircraft in the United States, a fuel called 100LL, and the fact that it contains lead, has always contained lead, and after decades of knowing this, the aviation industry is finally, genuinely, actually running out of runway to keep pretending it can stay that way forever. If you fly, if you own an airplane, if you're thinking about buying into general aviation at any price point right now, or if you're just trying to understand where this industry is actually headed underneath all the airshow footage and the carefully worded press releases, this is the story you need to understand. Because the end of 100LL, whenever it comes, however it comes, is not just a fuel chemistry story. It is a story about aircraft values, about flight school economics, about airport infrastructure, about who gets to stay in aviation and who quietly exits it, and about a set of decisions made decades ago that the current generation of pilots and owners is now inheriting whether they ask to or not. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this channel covers the financial and structural realities of general aviation in a way that most coverage simply doesn't. And if you want to understand where this industry is actually going instead of where it says it's going, you don't want to miss what's coming. Let's start at the very beginning, because the leaded fuel story makes a lot more sense once you understand why lead got into aviation gasoline in the first place, how long that decision has been with us, and why it proved so much harder to reverse than almost anyone who understood the problem early actually expected. Tetraethyl lead was added to aviation gasoline as an anti-knock compound, a way of allowing piston engines operating at high compression ratios to run without detonation, which is the catastrophic and very rapid uncontrolled combustion event that destroys pistons, ruins cylinders, and in the worst cases comes for the entire engine in a matter of seconds. The high-octane rating that aircraft engines need to operate reliably, particularly at high power settings during takeoff and climb, has historically required either lead additives or engine designs built specifically for a different chemistry. For decades, the trade-off was simple. Add a small amount of tetraethyl lead, get the octane you need, and move on. This was not a unique decision to aviation. Automotive gasoline contained lead for most of the 20th century, for very similar reasons. The difference is that automotive gasoline phased lead out completely in the United States by 1996, while aviation gasoline did not. And that divergence between the car world and the airplane world is the entire origin story of where we are today. The reason aviation held on while automobiles moved on comes down to a combination of technical, regulatory, and economic factors that are worth spending a moment on, because they explain a great deal of why this problem has proven so stubborn. Automobile engines could be redesigned over a period of years to run on unleaded fuel by reducing compression ratios, adjusting timing, and eventually incorporating hardened valve seats that don't require lead as a lubricant. The automotive industry did all of that, spread over a manageable transition period, and it worked. General aviation was not in the same position. The piston aircraft fleet in the United States is an enormously diverse collection of airframes built across several decades, certified under a regulatory process that is much slower and more rigid than automotive engineering, and operated by a community that is small enough in economic terms that developing, certifying, and distributing a genuinely new fuel chemistry is a vastly more complicated undertaking than it sounds from the outside. You cannot simply reformulate the fuel and put it in the existing distribution system and tell everyone to fill up, because some percentage of engines currently certified on 100LL will not operate safely on a different fuel chemistry without modifications, without recertification, or without being replaced entirely. And every one of those words, modifications, recertification, replacement, means real money coming out of real owners' pockets. Here is where the scale of the actual problem becomes concrete. There are somewhere in the range of 160,000 to 170,000 piston-powered aircraft currently registered in the United States. The overwhelming majority of them run on 100LL. Every single one of those aircraft, every engine in that fleet, was certified to operate on a specific fuel specification, and any change to that specification for any specific aircraft requires either a fuel approval that covers the existing type certificate, a supplemental type certificate for a new approval, or some other regulatory path that satisfies the Federal Aviation Administration that the fuel and engine combination has been demonstrated to be safe. For a large portion of the fleet, particularly older engines with higher compression ratios and designs that specifically depend on the anti-knock properties LEED provides, that path is genuinely complicated and sometimes expensive. For others, it is more straightforward. The catch is that the fleet is so diverse, spanning so many engine models, airframe types, and operational contexts, that there is no single solution that covers everyone at once, and the process of getting individual approvals across thousands of engine and airframe combinations takes time, money, and regulatory bandwidth that is itself a finite resource. Now layer onto that the environmental and public health dimension, because this is what has been driving regulatory pressure for years, and is increasingly what's driving the urgency that the industry is operating under right now. Lead is a neurotoxin. There is no safe level of lead exposure, and aviation gasoline is, at this point, the single largest remaining source of lead emissions from transportation sources in the United States. Studies examining blood lead levels in children living near airports where piston aircraft operations are concentrated have produced findings that are difficult to ignore and have produced exactly the kind of attention from environmental regulators and public health advocates that the aviation community has, at times, struggled to respond to cleanly. The EPA has been on a path toward making an endangerment finding around aviation gasoline lead emissions, a formal legal and regulatory conclusion that creates real enforcement obligations rather than just voluntary program targets, and that process has been moving forward even as the aviation side has been working on its own transition timelines. When those two tracks converge, when regulatory mandate from the environmental side meets a not quite finished fuel transition from the aviation side, the result could be a forced, compressed, disorderly end to 100 LL, rather than the managed, orderly transition that the industry has been working toward. The difference between those two outcomes is enormous, and understanding that difference is a large part of understanding why the stakes here are actually as high as they are. So what has actually been done about this? Because this problem has been recognized for a long time, and it would be unfair to suggest that nothing has happened. A lot has happened. The challenge is understanding what has happened, what it actually solved, and what it left unresolved, because all three of those answers matter for what comes next. The most significant recent development in the unleaded avgas story is the approval by the FAA of GAMI's G100UL, a fully unleaded drop-in replacement fuel that has been demonstrated to work across a very wide range of the certified piston fleet without modification. GAMI, which is a small Oklahoma-based engine research company, spent well over a decade and a genuinely extraordinary amount of their own money developing and certifying this fuel, and their supplemental type certificate approval in 2022 was a real, meaningful milestone. The fuel works, the chemistry is sound, the performance is equivalent to or better than 100 LL across the engine types it covers. This is not vaporware, and it is not a partial solution. It is a legitimately viable replacement fuel for a significant portion of the fleet. The problem is not whether the fuel works. The problem is everything else. Getting a fuel from FAA approval through to widespread commercial production, distribution infrastructure, and actual physical availability at the airports where pilots actually need it is a completely separate challenge from demonstrating that the chemistry is safe and the performance is adequate. G100UL needs to be manufactured at scale by refiners who are willing to invest in that production capacity, delivered through distribution networks that currently are not built around it, and made physically available at fuel farms and fuel trucks at airports across the country, many of which have limited storage capacity, and changing their fuel supply involves real logistical and sometimes regulatory hurdles of their own. That infrastructure build takes time, takes capital, and takes buy-in from players across the supply chain who are making business decisions about whether the volume of demand justifies the investment. And because the general aviation market is relatively small in economic terms compared to automotive or commercial aviation fuel markets, those business case calculations are not always straightforward. There is also the Swift Fuel story, which is a different approach to the same problem and worth understanding separately. Swift developed 100R, their own unleaded formula, pursuing a different certification pathway and positioning it as a renewable component product rather than purely a synthetic replacement. The landscape of potential replacement fuels has never been a simple single-option situation, and the competition between different replacement products, different certification pathways, and different distribution strategies has added a layer of complexity to the transition that has occasionally made it harder to get the industry aligned around a single path forward in the way that transition would benefit from. Meanwhile, the FAA's PAFI program, the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, was the agency's own attempt to manage the transition to unleaded fuel in a coordinated way, working with fuel developers to evaluate candidate fuels against the broadest possible sweep of the existing fleet. The program ran for years, evaluated multiple fuel candidates, and ultimately did not produce a single approved fleet-wide replacement on the timeline that was originally hoped for, partly because the technical bar for covering the entire certified fleet, including the high-compression engines that are most dependent on lead's anti-knock properties, proved higher than anticipated. PAFI was not a failure in the sense of producing no useful information, but it was also not the clean, coordinated, everyone-covered solution that the industry needed, and its extended timeline contributed to the sense, in some quarters, that the transition was moving slower than the regulatory and public health pressure demanded. What this adds up to is a transition that is genuinely underway, that has produced real progress, and that is also genuinely incomplete in ways that matter enormously for specific parts of the fleet and specific parts of the country. Understanding where the gaps are is the most important thing for anyone making decisions about aircraft ownership, flight school operations, or airport infrastructure right now, because the impact of those gaps is not going to fall evenly across the aviation community. Let's talk about what an uneven transition actually looks like in practice, because this is where the story stops being abstract and starts being about dollars and decisions. The aircraft that are in the clearest position right now are the ones that are already approved for the unleaded alternatives, either through the original type certificate covering a broader fuel approval, through the STC pathway that GAMI has created, or through engine designs that were developed recently enough to be engineered around unleaded fuel from the beginning. Modern Continental and Lycoming engines, and particularly the engines in newer production aircraft, have been increasingly designed with the fuel transition in mind, and many of them have approval pathways that are already in place or relatively close to being in place. If you own a newer airplane with a modern engine variant and you're looking at this problem, your situation is meaningfully different from someone flying a legacy high-compression engine from the 1970s that was designed specifically around the anti-knock properties that LEED provides. The engines and airframes that are in the most complicated position are the ones at the high end of the compression spectrum, particularly older direct drive engines running at higher compression ratios that were certified in an era when 100 LL's specific chemistry was simply assumed as a constant. These engines are disproportionately found in older but still widely flown and widely valued airframes, specific variants of popular models that have been part of the general aviation landscape for decades, and represent real, substantial portions of the working fleet. For the owners of these aircraft, the fuel transition is not an abstract industry-level story. It is a direct question about whether the airplane they own today will have an available, affordable, legal fuel to run on 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or beyond. And here is where the financial dimension of this story becomes very real and very specific. Aircraft values in the current used market are already partly reflecting the uncertainty around 100 LL's future, even if that reflection is subtle and uneven and not always easy to separate from other factors. When a buyer is evaluating a high-compression Continental or Lycoming engine variant today, and they're being thoughtful about their purchase, one of the questions on the list is fuel availability and fuel approval status for that specific engine, and the answer to that question varies depending on which engine you're looking at. The aircraft that have clear, established approval pathways for one of the available unleaded alternatives are trading differently in the market than comparable airframes where the fuel situation is murkier, even if the difference in value hasn't fully crystallized yet into numbers that show up cleanly in published price guides. The valuation gap between fuel clear and fuel uncertain is real, it's growing, and it's going to become much more visible as the transition timeline compresses. For a buyer doing due diligence in the current market, this means the fuel approval status of any aircraft you're seriously considering needs to be on the checklist, alongside the logbooks, the AD compliance status, and the avionics package. This is not a hypothetical future concern. that you can defer until later. It is a present material factor in the long-term value and operational viability of what you are considering buying, and ignoring it because it feels complicated or because the immediate purchase economics look good is a choice that can cost real money when you go to sell that airplane in a market where the fuel situation has clarified further. Now let's talk about what this means for flight schools, because the training side of this story is distinct enough to deserve its own extended treatment, and the stakes are genuinely high. Flight schools are the front door to general aviation. They are the point where new pilots enter the system, where the industry renews itself, and where a significant portion of the aircraft utilization in the general aviation fleet actually happens. Flight training is also an extraordinarily thin-margin business in most of its forms, and the economic model of a typical flight school is brittle in ways that most outside observers don't fully appreciate. When fuel costs move, flight school economics move with them, directly and immediately, because fuel is one of the largest operating line items in the business. A flight school cannot absorb a meaningful fuel price increase the way a commercial airline can, by hedging fuel costs across a huge operation with sophisticated treasury management. A small or mid-size flight school is buying fuel at local retail prices, pricing their rental rates based on assumptions about what fuel costs, and absorbing the gap when reality diverges from assumption, or passing it through to students in the form of higher rental rates that make training more expensive, and sometimes push students out of the pipeline entirely. The transition away from 100LL creates a specific kind of risk for flight schools that is worth naming clearly. If replacement fuels, whether G100UL, Swift's products, or anything else, are priced at a premium to 100LL during the transition period, and there are genuinely good reasons to expect they will be, at least initially because of the production scale and distribution cost dynamics we talked about earlier, then flight schools flying high-utilization training fleets are going to absorb those higher per-gallon costs across a very large number of gallons, because training aircraft fly constantly. The cost difference between a replacement fuel priced at, say, 50 cents or $1 more per gallon and current 100LL prices might sound modest for a private owner flying 100 hours a year. For a flight school, flying a fleet of 5 or 8 or 12 aircraft at combined utilization rates that might represent thousands of hours annually, that per-gallon difference becomes a very significant operating cost increase, one that eventually shows up either in higher rental rates that price out student pilots or in compressed margins that make the business model less viable. There is also the aircraft compatibility issue on the training fleet side. Many flight schools operate older, high-utilization airframes that have been in their fleet for years and that represent the core of their fleet value. These are often Cessna 172s from various production years, Piper aircraft, Diamond trainers, and other proven platforms. The fuel approval status of those specific airframes and their specific engine variants is a material question for fleet operators, because a training airplane that cannot legally operate on an available replacement fuel when 100LL becomes scarce or unavailable is not just an airplane with a compliance problem. It is a revenue-generating asset that has potentially become non-revenue generating, and the capital cost of replacing it or modifying it falls directly on the flight school's balance sheet. Forward-thinking flight school operators are already working through this. The ones who are managing this well are doing engine-by-engine, airframe-by-airframe audits of their fleet's fuel approval status, understanding exactly which aircraft have clear pathways and which ones are in uncertain territory, and building that information into their fleet replacement and capital planning. The ones who are not doing this work now are building up a risk that will eventually surface, and it will surface at a time and in a manner that is much harder to manage than it would have been if it had been addressed proactively. For student pilots who are currently in training or thinking about starting training, the flight school fuel situation matters in a practical way. A flight school whose economics are already under pressure from thin margins, rising insurance costs, and instructor shortage challenges does not need additional fuel cost pressure added to the stack. When flight schools get into financial difficulty, the consequences cascade quickly. Aircraft maintenance gets deferred, instructor retention gets harder because salaries can't be sustained, and in the worst cases, schools close entirely, leaving students mid-training with hours logged in a logbook and no program to complete them in. Understanding whether the flight school you're considering or currently attending has thought through its fuel transition situation is not paranoid or excessive due diligence. It is a reasonable thing to know. Let's widen the lens now and talk about airport infrastructure, because the fuel transition story at the airport infrastructure level is something that gets almost no mainstream coverage and that has enormous implications for how the transition actually plays out across the country. Airports that serve general aviation, the more than 5,000 public-use general aviation airports in the United States, are not a monolithic category. They range from major reliever airports serving large metropolitan areas with multiple fuel suppliers, full maintenance capabilities, and high daily aircraft movements, all the way down to small rural airports that may have a single self-serve fuel pump, a handful of based aircraft, and annual operating budgets that are measured in the tens of thousands of dollars rather than the millions. The fuel infrastructure at these airports, meaning the storage tanks, the distribution equipment, the supplier relationships, and the operational processes around fueling, is built around 100 LL because that's what has always been available and what has always been needed. Transitioning that infrastructure to support a new fuel is not a purely technical problem, even though there are technical dimensions to it. It is primarily an economic and capital problem. A small general aviation airport that wants to add the capability to supply one of the approved unleaded replacement fuels is looking at the cost of either adding a separate storage tank and fueling system, because during the transition period, you can't simply swap out the entire 100 LL inventory for something else overnight, given that not every aircraft in the fleet is approved for the replacement, or working out a supply arrangement that allows them to receive and distribute the new fuel through existing infrastructure where that's compatible. Either path involves capital that small airport operators frequently do not have access to, requires buy-in from fuel suppliers who need to see sufficient local demand to justify the logistics of delivering a new fuel to a small location, and takes time to execute even when the will and the resources exist. The result is that replacement fuel availability is going to be extremely uneven geographically, particularly in the early and middle phases of the transition, and that geographic unevenness is not a minor logistical inconvenience. It is a fundamental constraint on how pilots can fly, where they can go, and what route planning looks like when you cannot count on the fuel you need being available at your destination or en route stop. Think about what this actually means for cross-country flying if you own an aircraft that requires unleaded replacement fuel and that replacement fuel is only available at a fraction of airports. In the automotive world, the infrastructure transition away from leaded fuel worked partly because the distribution network for gasoline is so dense, and the refueling intervals for cars are so frequent relative to their travel speed, that coverage gaps were manageable. In aviation, you might be looking at a 150 or 200-mile leg to your destination, and the airport you're stopping at may be a small field with a single pump that has not and may not make the capital investment in a new fuel supply infrastructure during the transition period. If that airport has 100 LL and your airplane is only approved for unleaded, you either divert to a larger field with better infrastructure, you carry enough fuel to complete the mission without that stop, or you're grounded. None of those outcomes are operationally neutral, and for pilots whose missions depend on the ability to use smaller, more conveniently located airports, the infrastructure unevenness is a very real constraint on the utility of their airplane. The airports that serve as instrument approach points in rural areas, that serve as stops for medical transport, agricultural operations, and business aviation in communities too small for commercial service, are often exactly the airports where the infrastructure transition will be slowest and most difficult. This is not a small thing. General aviation's role in providing access to communities that have no other air service, that depend on small piston aircraft for medical, business, and essential transportation functions, is genuine and important, and a poorly managed fuel transition that compromises the ability of that infrastructure layer to operate is not a story about hobbyist inconvenience. It is a story about real access and real economic function in parts of the country that depend on it. At the larger end of the airport spectrum, the transition picture is meaningfully more optimistic. Major general aviation reliever airports, the ones serving dense metro areas with multiple based aircraft, high fuel volumes, and sophisticated FBO operations, are both more capable of managing the infrastructure investment and more likely to see the commercial demand that makes that investment attractive to fuel suppliers. These airports will, in general, have access to replacement fuels sooner and more reliably than smaller airports, which means the transition will tend to work first and best for pilots who are based at or regularly operating through major facilities. The pilots in rural areas, flying off small strips, doing the kind of backcountry and utility flying that is actually one of general aviation's most important functions, are the ones for whom the transition timeline and the infrastructure gap are the most pressing practical problems. Let's talk about what this means for aircraft manufacturing, because the fuel transition is not just a story about the existing fleet. It is also shaping what manufacturers are building, what they're certifying, and what the next generation of general aviation aircraft actually looks like. Aircraft manufacturers have been living with this problem for long enough that it has genuinely shaped product development decisions at the engine and airframe level. Continental and Lycoming, the two dominant piston aircraft engine manufacturers in the United States, have both been doing active work on engine variants and certifications that address the unleaded transition. Continental's CD series diesel engines, which run on jet fuel rather than avgas and therefore sidestep the 100LL question entirely, have been an explicit response to the fuel uncertainty, though as we've covered in other contexts, the diesel piston segment has faced its own adoption challenges that have kept it from being a complete solution to the transition problem. Lycoming's work on new fuel approvals for existing engine families represents a different approach, working within the existing gasoline engine architecture to broaden the fuel approval envelope rather than moving to an entirely different fuel type. The manufacturers of complete aircraft have also been incorporating fuel transition considerations into their product development and their marketing, though sometimes in ways that are clearer to understand than others. A new aircraft sold today with an engine that has already been demonstrated and approved for one of the available unleaded alternatives has a genuinely different long-term value proposition than one where the fuel approval pathway is still in progress, and the manufacturers who can clearly articulate that difference are in a stronger competitive position as buyers get more sophisticated about asking these questions. The electric and hybrid electric aircraft development happening across the industry is, at one level, partly a response to the fuel problem. If you're not burning avgas at all, the 100LL question simply doesn't apply to your aircraft. But as we've covered before, the certification and infrastructure path for electric propulsion in the certified aircraft world is its own long, complicated story, and the timeline for electric aircraft to represent a meaningful share of actual general aviation operations, as opposed to a meaningful share of aviation press releases, is measured in years or decades rather than quarters. The fuel transition cannot wait for electric aviation to solve it, and anyone who is thinking clearly about this recognizes that the near and medium-term solution has to work within the existing piston combustion architecture, because that is the world where the fleet actually lives today. Now, let's spend some real time on the valuation and financial implications, because this is the area where the decisions you make or don't make in the next several years are going to have real, lasting consequences for your financial position relative to aviation. Aircraft values are a function of many things: condition, airframe and engine time, avionics, paint and interior quality, maintenance history, accident history, and market demand for the specific type. The fuel approval status of the specific aircraft is currently underweighted as a valuation factor in the way that most buyers and sellers approach the conversation. But that is changing, and it is going to continue changing, and the direction of that change is not ambiguous. An aircraft that is clearly approved to operate on available unleaded alternatives, that has the STC in place, that has a clean compliance path regardless of what happens to 100LL availability, has a long-term operational viability that an equivalent aircraft without that approval does not. For now, because 100LL is still widely available, that difference does not create a dramatic valuation gap. In the medium term, as availability of 100LL becomes patchier in some regions, as the regulatory pressure on leaded fuel distribution intensifies, and as buyers doing their homework become more sophisticated about asking about fuel compliance, that valuation gap is going to widen. The aircraft that are at the front of the compliance queue will hold value better. The aircraft that are at the back, the ones where the fuel approval pathway is complicated, expensive, or uncertain, are going to face increasing value pressure that is separate from and additional to all the other factors that normally drive depreciation. This creates a specific kind of risk for buyers who are looking at the used market today. An airplane that looks attractive on the standard evaluation criteria, good logs, reasonable time, clean airframe, competitive price, can look very different once you map out its fuel compliance situation carefully. There are currently aircraft trading in the used market at prices that do not fully reflect the cost and complication of getting them to a clear, unleaded compliance position, partly because not every buyer is asking this question yet, and partly because sellers are not always volunteering information that would complicate the conversation. The buyers who are doing the work of understanding fuel approval status before they commit are identifying a material variable that has not yet been fully priced into the market. The buyers who are not asking are accepting a risk they may not know they're taking. For sellers, the implication is different but equally important. If you own an aircraft that has a complicated fuel compliance situation, the time to address it, either by pursuing the appropriate STC, by being proactive about the modifications needed for a clear approval pathway, or at minimum by understanding exactly what that pathway looks like and what it costs, is now, before the market fully reprices fuel uncertainty into valuations. An airplane that you sell today at a price that doesn't reflect a fuel compliance discount, because the buyer didn't ask and you didn't volunteer, may look different in retrospect if the buyer later discovers the complication and comes looking for recourse, or if you simply hold the airplane another 3 or 4 years and the market has repriced by then. Getting ahead of this now is almost certainly better than having the repricing happen to you while you're still holding the asset. For aircraft that are simply not going to have a clean path to unleaded compliance, older high-compression engines where the modification cost is genuinely prohibitive, or types where the certification economics don't support an STC applicant pursuing approval, the long-term trajectory is one of declining utility and declining value as 100 LL availability shrinks. That trajectory might be slow for the first several years and then accelerate sharply as regional availability gaps start appearing. Owners of these aircraft need to be thinking clearly about when the right point is to exit the asset, not waiting until the problem is obvious to everyone, including buyers, because by that point, the value damage will already have been done. Let's talk about geography for a moment, because the impact of this transition is going to be dramatically different depending on where you fly and where you're based, and that geographic dimension is something that general, national-level discussions of the fuel transition often underweight. If you're based at a major metropolitan reliever airport with multiple FBOs, high fuel volume, and strong commercial relationships with fuel distributors, your access to unleaded alternatives is going to be earlier and better than most. You'll see pumps added, supply chains developed, and competition among fuel providers that keeps the premium manageable. Your transition experience is going to look relatively smooth. If you're based at a rural strip in the interior of the country, particularly in regions with lower overall general aviation density, the timeline looks different. Fuel distributors make infrastructure investment decisions based on volume economics, and a small airport moving a modest number of gallons per month is simply not the same business case as a major reliever moving thousands of gallons per day. The rural airport may be among the last to see unleaded alternatives available, and if 100 LL supply is constrained or eliminated before the replacement infrastructure reaches that airport, the aircraft based there face a practical operational problem that is genuinely difficult to solve without relocating to a better served facility, which has its own costs and complications for owners whose hangars, maintenance relationships, and community ties are at that airport. There is a real possibility that the fuel transition, as it actually unfolds in practice, accelerates a consolidation of general aviation activity toward larger airports and away from smaller rural fields. If pilots operating fuel-sensitive aircraft cannot count on fuel availability at small airports, the rational response is to base at a larger facility with more reliable supply, which means fewer aircraft based at small airports, which means less fuel volume sold at those airports, which makes the commercial case for investing in new fuel infrastructure there even harder, which means even fewer aircraft willing to base there. This is a feedback loop, not a one-time effect, and in rural communities that already have thin general aviation infrastructure and that rely on small airports for important functions, this dynamic could have consequences that go well beyond the aviation community itself. State aviation authorities and airport sponsors are aware of this risk, and some are actively working on it, developing grant programs and infrastructure support mechanisms to help smaller airports make the transition without falling into the gap. Whether that support materializes at the scale and pace needed to prevent meaningful coverage gaps is genuinely uncertain, and anyone who tells you they know exactly how this geographic dimension plays out is either more confident or less informed than the situation warrants. Now, let's talk about what practically smart looks like right now, because understanding the problem is only useful if it informs actual decisions. If you are currently shopping for a used aircraft, fuel approval status belongs on your pre-purchase checklist, alongside everything else. Not as an afterthought once you've already fallen in love with an airplane, but as a first-round filter question before you invest serious evaluation time. For any aircraft you're seriously considering, you want to know the specific engine model, the current approved fuel list for that engine and airframe combination, whether G100UL or other available unleaded alternatives are already covered by the type certificate or by an existing STC, and if not, what the path to coverage looks like and what it costs. Your A&P can help with some of this. GAMI's website has coverage information. The engine manufacturers publish approved fuel documentation. This is not information that is hidden from you. It requires effort to compile and evaluate, but it is available to anyone who goes looking. If you own an aircraft and you have not done this analysis, doing it now costs nothing but time and gives you information that is increasingly material to understanding what you own. Contact your engine manufacturer's technical support line. Check the STC database. Understand whether the approval exists, whether it applies to your specific serial number and engine configuration, and what the compliance process looks like if you want to act on it. This is not a reason to panic, because 100LL is still available and will continue to be available for the foreseeable near term. It is a reason to be informed, because the decisions you make from an informed position are going to be better than the ones you make because you waited until the urgency was undeniable. If you're a flight school operator, the fleet audit we talked about is the starting point. Beyond that, the relationship you have with your fuel supplier is worth examining through the lens of the transition. What does your current fuel supplier know about unleaded alternative supply in your region? Are they working with distributors who are developing replacement fuel delivery capability? Are there conversations worth having now about when and how your airport might see unleaded alternative availability, and what your operation needs to be positioned for that transition without a disruptive gap in supply? These are not conversations that require you to have answers. They require you to be in the room when decisions about infrastructure and supply planning are being made, because flight schools represent meaningful fuel volume at many airports, and that volume gives you a seat at the table if you choose to use it. If you're a pilot thinking about entering aviation for the first time, this whole story is actually somewhat different for you than it is for existing owners, because you have something they don't: the ability to start with a complete picture rather than work backward from existing assets. You can make a first purchase with fuel compliance built into the decision criteria from the beginning. You can look at training environments and ask whether the flight school you're considering has thought about this. You can, if your mission fits, consider aircraft types that already have established unleaded approvals as a first rather than a second consideration. The transition is a complication for people with existing stakes in the affected parts of the fleet. For someone entering fresh, it is an information advantage waiting to be used. What about the manufacturers and the regulatory side? Is there any reason to believe the transition management is going to improve from here? This is honestly the most genuinely uncertain piece of the whole picture, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that uncertainty, rather than paper over it with false precision. There is real reason for optimism at the technical level. The fuel chemistry problem has been solved, in the sense that products exist that demonstrably work across a large share of the piston fleet. That is a genuinely different situation than existed 5 years ago, when the question of whether a drop-in replacement could be developed at all was still open. The approval process for aircraft and engines to use these fuels is moving, slowly and unevenly, but genuinely moving, and each approval that happens makes the coverage picture clearer for at least some segment of the fleet. There is real reason for concern at the infrastructure and policy level. The gap between having an approved fuel and having that fuel physically available at airports where it is needed is a problem that requires capital, coordination, and commercial alignment that has not yet been fully achieved. The timeline pressure from environmental regulation is real, and the aviation industry does not control that timeline. It can respond to it, can advocate within it, but it cannot make the regulatory clock move at a pace it finds comfortable. And the diversity of the fleet, the range of engine and airframe types that need individual attention to get to full unleaded compliance, means that a solution that works for a lot of the fleet is not the same as a solution that works for all of it, and the remaining edge cases are not going to take care of themselves without continued, sustained effort. The best realistic version of how this plays out involves continued incremental progress on fleet coverage, growing commercial scale of replacement fuel production as more aircraft are approved and demand becomes more predictable, a gradual rollout of infrastructure at airports, starting with the larger and higher volume facilities and working outward, a managed phase-out of 100 LL on a timeline that gives the majority of the fleet a clear path to compliance before the fuel disappears from the market, and enough regulatory coordination between the FAA and the EPA to prevent the forced, disorderly version of the transition that would be genuinely damaging to the industry and to the communities it serves. That version is possible. It is not guaranteed. It requires sustained effort from manufacturers, fuel developers, airport operators, regulatory agencies, and the pilot and owner community itself to demand and support real progress rather than treating this as someone else's problem to solve. The worst realistic version involves regulatory timelines that outrun the infrastructure build, regional supply failures that ground aircraft in underserved areas, a wave of aircraft value impairment as fuel uncertainty prices itself into the used market faster than compliance pathways can be cleared, and a general aviation infrastructure that looks significantly thinner on the other side of the transition than it did going in. That version is also possible, particularly in the rural and lower density markets that are most vulnerable to being left behind in the transition. The version that actually happens will be somewhere between those two, shaped by decisions and investments that are being made right now, in the next year or 2 or 3, by a range of actors whose individual choices aggregate into an outcome nobody controls entirely. That is, frankly, how most large systemic transitions work in the real world. The people who navigate them best are the ones who understand the range of possible outcomes, who position themselves for resilience across that range rather than optimizing for a single expected scenario, and who make decisions about assets and operations with clear eyes about the risks and uncertainties that are present, rather than the ones that are convenient. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves space before we close, which is the human dimension, and specifically what the fuel transition means for the question of who stays in general aviation through this period and who quietly exits it. General aviation has been dealing with a pilot population and aircraft owner base that has been contracting slowly and unevenly for decades. The cost of entering aviation has risen faster than most people's ability to absorb it. The complexity of ownership, maintenance costs, insurance, hangar availability, avionics currency, regulatory compliance has increased in ways that push the break-even calculus toward walking away for a meaningful share of current owners every year. The fuel transition is one more item on that list, and for some owners, particularly those with aircraft in the more complicated compliance categories, it may be the item that tips the decision. Not because any single owner cannot manage the cost or complexity of the fuel situation in isolation, but because it is being added to a stack of cost and complexity items that is already high enough to be causing exits, and adding one more thing to a stack that is already tipping over does not require that thing to be extraordinarily large to have real consequences. If the fuel transition is managed in a way that adds meaningful cost to ownership, that creates logistical complications for cross-country operations, and that impairs the value of a significant portion of the existing fleet, it will accelerate the consolidation of aircraft ownership toward a smaller, wealthier, more professionally oriented owner base, and away from the individual private owners, small business operators, and weekend flyers who have historically been the broad base of general aviation culture and activity. That is not a catastrophic outcome in some narrow sense, but it represents a real change in the character of the aviation community and in the accessibility of flying as something that ordinary people with professional incomes can realistically pursue as a meaningful part of their lives. Conversely, a transition that is managed well, that preserves operational access across the geographic footprint of general aviation, that keeps the compliance cost manageable, that provides clear and relatively inexpensive paths for the existing fleet to remain viable, could actually consolidate some of the uncertainty that has been hanging over the industry for years and produce a cleaner, more stable foundation for the kind of gradual growth that aviation has been trying to generate for a long time. Getting past the leaded fuel problem, actually getting past it rather than managing around it indefinitely, removes a genuine long-term risk from the industry's balance sheet. It removes an ongoing source of public health and environmental criticism that has complicated aviation's relationship with communities around airports. It removes an operational and financial uncertainty that has been quietly discouraging some prospective buyers who look at the situation and decide the risk is